The year is 1066. Europe stands at a crossroads between ages. The old world of Viking raiders and Saxon kingdoms teeters on the edge of transformation. From the cold waters of the North Sea to the sunlit shores of the Mediterranean, the continent holds its breath, sensing that great changes are coming. In the monasteries of England, monks bend over their parchments, recording the affairs of kings and the movements of armies. They do not yet know that they are living through one of history's most consequential years. A year when three great battles will determine the fate of nations, and when the medieval world will truly begin. The autumn winds blow cold across the North Sea, carrying with them the scent of salt and the promise of violence. In Norway, a giant of a man makes his final preparations for the greatest gamble of his life. In Normandy, a duke watches the weather, waiting for his moment to strike. And in England, a newly crowned king surveys his realm, knowing that enemies gather on all sides. This is the story of how one September day changed everything. How in the span of a few terrible hours, an entire age came to its end. How 10,000 warriors vanished from the earth, taking with them a way of life that had endured for centuries. But to understand that day, we must first understand the world that created it. For more than 250 years, the Vikings had been the terror of Europe. From their first recorded raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793, these seafaring warriors from Scandinavia had descended upon Christian Europe like a divine punishment. Their dragon-proud ships appeared without warning on misty mornings, bringing fire, sword, and devastation. The very word Viking struck fear into the hearts of medieval Europeans. Monks prayed desperately, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us." Coastal villages lived in constant dread of seeing those distinctive sails appear on the horizon. Kings and emperors struggled to defend their realms against these swift, merciless raiders. But the Vikings were far more than simple pirates. They were explorers who reached America centuries before Columbus. They were traders who established commercial networks stretching from Baghdad to Iceland. They were settlers who founded cities like Dublin, York, and Novgorod. They were poets, craftsmen, and lawmakers with a rich culture all their own. Their success came from several factors. First, their ships, the legendary longships, were technological marvels. Sleek, fast, and shallow-drafted, they could navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers. A Viking crew could beach their ship, raid a monastery, and be gone before any defense could be organized. When pursued, they could row up rivers too shallow for the heavier ships of their enemies. Second, the Vikings were professional warriors in an age of amateur soldiers. While European armies were often hastily assembled militias, Viking crews trained together constantly. They lived by a warrior code that valued courage, skill, and loyalty above all else. A Viking warrior would rather die fighting than live with the shame of cowardice. Third, they had timing on their side. The early medieval period was an era of political fragmentation in Europe. The great empire of Charlemagne had broken apart into squabbling kingdoms. Rulers were often at war with each other and could not present a united front against Viking raids. The Norsemen exploited these divisions brilliantly, playing one king against another. But by the middle of the 11th century, things were changing. The great age of Viking expansion was drawing to a close. Christianity had spread to Scandinavia itself, bringing new values and new connections to the rest of Europe. The fragmented kingdoms were consolidating into stronger, more organized states. Professional armies and stone castles were replacing militia levies and wooden forts. The wild, freebooting Vikings were becoming something else. Christian kings ruling settled realms, more interested in trade and agriculture than raiding. The transformation was gradual, uneven, but inexorable. The old ways were fading, yet in 1066, there still lived men who remembered the glory days. Men who had grown up hearing the sagas of great raids and mighty conquests. Men who refused to accept that the Viking age was ending. And the greatest of these men was Harald Hardrada. Harald Sigurdsson was born around 1015 into the royal house of Norway, but his early life was marked by loss and exile rather than power and glory. His half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, had become king of Norway and attempted to convert the realm to Christianity by force. This provoked a rebellion among the Norwegian nobles, who preferred their traditional gods and resented Olaf's autocratic methods. In 1030, when Harald was only 15 years old, his world shattered at the Battle of Stiklestad. King Olaf's army faced the rebel forces in a desperate struggle for Norway's future. The battle was fierce and bloody, and when it ended, Olaf lay dead, pierced by 3 mortal wounds. The young Harald, fighting at his brother's side, was also wounded, but managed to escape the battlefield. With Olaf's death, Harald became a hunted fugitive in his own land. The new rulers of Norway wanted no surviving members of Olaf's line to threaten their power. So Harald fled, beginning a journey that would take him across the known world and transform him from a teenage refugee into the most feared warrior of his age. He first traveled east into the vast expanse of the Kievan Rus, the Slavic kingdoms ruled by Viking adventurers who had come east generations before. There, Harald found temporary refuge at the court of Yaroslav the Wise, Grand Prince of Kiev. It was a glittering court, enriched by trade routes that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world. Here, Harald learned statecraft and diplomacy, skills that would serve him well in later years. But Harald was not content to be a courtier. He was a warrior, and he craved action, glory, and wealth. So in 1034, when he was 19 years old, he led a band of Viking adventurers south to Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world, capital of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople in the 11th century was a place of wonders. Its walls were said to be impregnable, its churches adorned with gold and precious stones, its markets filled with goods from 3 continents. The Byzantine emperors, heirs to the Roman Caesars, commanded vast armies and sophisticated bureaucracies. They were the most powerful rulers in Christendom. And they employed the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Scandinavian warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards and shock troops. These were the finest fighters in the Byzantine army, feared and respected throughout the empire. To be accepted into the Varangian Guard was the highest honor a Viking warrior could achieve in foreign service. Harald joined the Varangians and quickly distinguished himself. He was tall, strong, fearless, and brilliant in combat. But he was also intelligent and cunning, qualities that made him valuable beyond the battlefield. The Byzantine Empire was engaged in constant warfare on multiple fronts, against Arab raiders in the east, Lombards in Italy, and Bulgarians in the Balkans. Harald fought in all these campaigns. In Sicily, he participated in the Byzantine attempt to reconquer the island from the Arabs. The chronicles record that he developed innovative siege tactics, including one famous incident where he used birds to set fire to a fortress. He captured the birds nesting in the fortress, tied burning materials to them, and released them. The birds flew back to their nests, setting the wooden buildings ablaze. Whether this story is true or embellished hardly matters. It illustrates Harald's reputation for clever, ruthless effectiveness. In Bulgaria, he fought against the uprising of Peter Delian. The Byzantines were attempting to suppress Bulgarian independence, and the war was brutal. Harald earned a reputation not just for courage but for cruelty. He was said to blind and mutilate prisoners as warnings to others. This harshness would become a hallmark of his career. Harald believed that fear was as effective a weapon as any sword. For 15 years, Harald served in the Byzantine forces, amassing enormous wealth from his share of plunder and imperial rewards. He became one of the wealthiest men in Constantinople, with chests full of gold and silver. But he also made enemies. His pride and ambition offended powerful courtiers. When the Empress Zoe came to power in 1042, Harald's position became precarious. The details are murky, but it appears Harald was imprisoned on trumped-up charges. He escaped, some sources say, with the help of sympathetic Varangians. Others claim he bribed his guards with part of his treasure. Whatever the truth, Harald fled Constantinople in dramatic fashion, reportedly sailing his ship through the chain that guarded the Golden Horn by having his crew run to the stern, lifting the bow over the chain, then running forward as the ship slid over. He returned to Kiev briefly, then made his way back to Scandinavia. He was 30 years old, immensely wealthy, covered in scars and glory, and ready to claim what he believed was his birthright, the throne of Norway. Norway in 1045 was ruled by Magnus the Good, son of the very King Olaf who had died at Stiklestad. In an ironic twist, Olaf had been declared a saint after his death, and his son had reclaimed the throne that Harald's brother had lost. Magnus was also king of Denmark, having inherited that crown through complex dynastic politics. Harald arrived in Norway with his Byzantine gold, and his battle-hardened reputation. He could have challenged Magnus for the throne, but instead he negotiated. The two men were, after all, relatives. Magnus was Harald's nephew. They reached an agreement to share power, with Harald recognized as co-king of Norway. This arrangement lasted barely a year. In 1047, Magnus died suddenly, probably of illness, though some whispered of poison. Harald became sole king of Norway and immediately set about proving that his surname, Hardrada, hard ruler, was well-earned. He was a king in the old Viking style, autocratic, warlike, magnificent, and terrifying. He built great halls and fortresses. He founded the city of Oslo. He reformed the coinage and established trade monopolies. He composed poetry celebrating his own deeds, for Harald was an accomplished skald in the Norse tradition. But above all, he made war. His great enemy was Svein Estridsson, king of Denmark. The conflict between Norway and Denmark had ancient roots, but Harald pursued it with exceptional ferocity. For 17 years, from 1047 to 1064, the two kingdoms were locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy in Scandinavia. The war was characterized by raids, naval battles, and occasional pitched battles on land. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Harald would raid the Danish coast, burning farms and killing livestock. Svein would retaliate with raids on Norwegian territory. Naval battles in the Kattegat and Skagerrak were frequent and bloody. Both kings proved skilled commanders, and both learned to respect each other's capabilities, even as they tried to destroy each other. The conflict was also ruinously expensive. Despite Harald's Byzantine treasure, maintaining constant warfare drained his resources. The Norwegian nobles grew weary of the endless levies and military service. By the early 1060s, it was clear that the war was achieving nothing. Neither kingdom could conquer the other. In 1064, Harald and Svein finally made peace. It was an exhausted peace, acknowledging the status quo rather than resolving the underlying rivalries. But it freed Harald to look elsewhere for glory and profit. He was now 50 years old, an age when most men of his era were thinking of retirement and preparing for death. But Harald was not most men. He had spent his entire adult life at war, and he could not imagine any other existence. He looked south, across the North Sea, to England, rich, fertile England, with its productive farms and wealthy churches. England, which his Norwegian predecessors had once ruled. England, which seemed ripe for conquest. To understand why Harald Hardrada invaded England in 1066, we must understand the tangled web of claims to the English throne. The story begins decades earlier in the reign of Canute the Great. Canute was a Danish king who conquered England in 1016, adding it to his North Sea empire that also included Denmark and Norway. He was a capable ruler who brought peace and prosperity to England after years of Viking raids and internal strife. When he died in 1035, his empire was divided among his sons. The English crown went to Harald Harefoot, then to Harthacnut. But Harthacnut died in 1042 without heirs, and the English nobles restored the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty by crowning Edward, son of the previous English king, Ethelred the Unready. Edward had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy and was more Norman than English in his tastes and sympathies. Edward the Confessor, as he became known due to his piety, ruled England for 24 years. He was devout, learned, and politically astute, but he had one crucial failing: he produced no heir. Whether this was due to impotence, religious celibacy, or simply bad luck, the result was the same. When Edward died in January 1066, England had no clear successor. Several claimants emerged immediately. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English earl and Edward's brother-in-law, claimed that Edward had designated him as heir on his deathbed. The English nobles, wanting an experienced military leader and preferring an Englishman to a foreign prince, supported his claim. Harold was crowned king on January 6, 1066, the very day Edward was buried. But others disputed his right to the throne. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the succession years earlier, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim. This oath, allegedly sworn on holy relics, became the moral justification for William's invasion plans. And then there was Harald Hardrada. His claim was based on an agreement between his predecessor, Magnus of Norway, and Harthacnut of England back in the 1030s. According to this pact, if either king died without heirs, the survivor would inherit both kingdoms. Magnus had never pressed this claim against Edward the Confessor, but Harald Hardrada now argued that the agreement still held. Through Magnus, he claimed, he was the rightful king of England. Most historians regard this as a flimsy pretext. The agreement had been between Magnus and Hardrada personally, not between Norway and England institutionally. It certainly didn't pass to Harald, who was not Magnus's heir in any direct sense. But in an age when might made right and possession was 9/10 of the law, the strength of one's legal claim mattered less than one's ability to enforce it. What really motivated Harald was not legalism, but opportunity. England was rich, poorly defended, and apparently divided. The new king, Harald Godwinson, was untried in battle and faced threats from multiple directions. It seemed the perfect moment for an ambitious warrior king to seize a crown. And then came the perfect alliance, with Tostig Godwinson, Harald's own brother. To understand Tostig's betrayal, we must understand the family from which both he and King Harald came, the House of Godwin, the most powerful noble family in England for a generation. Godwin himself had been a remarkable figure, rising from obscure origins to become Earl of Wessex, the richest and most powerful earldom in England. He was a political survivor who had served under 4 kings, Nut, Harold Harefoot, Harthacnut, and Edward the Confessor. He had arranged the marriage of his daughter Edith to King Edward, making himself the king's father-in-law and advisor. Godwin had multiple sons, and he secured earldoms for each of them, creating a network of family power that dominated England. Harold, the eldest surviving son, became Earl of East Anglia, and later succeeded his father as Earl of Wessex. Tostig received Northumbria, the northernmost earldom. Gurth got East Anglia after Harold moved to Wessex. Leofwine became Earl of Kent. The Godwin brothers controlled more than half of England, but family solidarity was never guaranteed in medieval politics. The brothers had different personalities, different interests, and different ideas about how to wield power. Rivalry simmered beneath the surface of their cooperation. Harold was pragmatic, politically astute, and popular with the English nobles and common people alike. He understood the art of compromise and knew when to fight and when to negotiate. He had proven himself in battles against the Welsh and had administered Wessex efficiently. When Edward the Confessor died, Harold was the obvious choice for king. Tostig was different. Where Harold was conciliatory, Tostig was harsh. Where Harold built consensus, Tostig demanded obedience. He ruled Northumbria with an iron fist, imposing heavy taxes and brutal punishments on those who resisted his authority. The Northumbrians, who had their own proud traditions and resented southern interference, grew to hate him. The crisis came in October 1065. The Northumbrian nobles rebelled against Tostig's rule, marching south with an army to demand his removal. They besieged York and declared Tostig outlawed, calling for Morcar, brother of the Earl of Mercia, to replace him. Tostig expected his brother Harold to support him with military force. After all, to allow a rebellion against one earl was to invite rebellions against all earls. The principle of noble authority was at stake. But Harold, who was effectively running the government for the aging and infirm Edward the Confessor, made a different calculation. England needed peace and unity, especially with foreign threats looming. A civil war in the north would weaken the entire kingdom. The Northumbrian grievances against Tostig appeared legitimate. His rule had indeed been oppressive. Harold chose to side with the rebels. At a meeting in Oxford, Harold negotiated a settlement with the Northumbrian representatives. Tostig would be removed from his earldom and go into exile. Morcar would become the new Earl of Northumbria. In exchange, the rebels would disperse peacefully and acknowledge Edward's authority. For Tostig, this was the ultimate betrayal. His own brother had chosen political expediency over family loyalty. His own brother had stripped him of his power and sent him into exile. The wound went deep, festering into hatred. Tostig went first to Flanders, where he was welcomed by Count Baldwin, whose daughter Judith was Tostig's wife. There he brooded on his grievances and plotted revenge. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066 and Harold took the crown, Tostig's fury knew no bounds. The brother who had betrayed him now wore England's crown. Tostig's first revenge attempt came in May 1066. He assembled a small fleet and raided along the English coast, hitting targets in the Isle of Wight, Norfolk, and Lincolnshire. These were pinprick attacks, more piracy than serious warfare, but they demonstrated Tostig's hostile intentions. Harald responded by mobilizing the English fleet and coastal defenses. Tostig's small force could not face the Royal Navy, so he fled north to Scotland, where King Malcolm gave him refuge. But Tostig was not content with mere harassment. He wanted to destroy Harald completely, to take from him everything as Harald had taken everything from Tostig. And so Tostig sought out the most dangerous ally he could find. Harald Hardrada, the terror of the north, the last great Viking warrior king. If Tostig could not defeat his brother alone, he would bring down a Norwegian avalanche upon England. The meeting between Tostig Godwinson and Harald Hardrada probably took place sometime in the spring or early summer of 1066, though the exact details are lost to history. What we know is that Tostig made Harald an offer the Norwegian king found irresistible. Tostig brought several valuable assets to the alliance. First, he had detailed knowledge of England's defenses, troop dispositions, and political divisions. He knew which nobles were loyal to Harald and which might be persuaded to switch sides. He understood the seasonal rhythms of English military mobilization, when the fyrd, the militia levy, would be called up and when it would be dismissed. Second, Tostig promised that he could deliver Northumbrian support. While the Northumbrians had rebelled against his harsh rule, Tostig argued that they would prefer a Norwegian king to continued rule by Harald. This was probably wishful thinking on Tostig's part, but Harald wanted to believe it. Third, and most importantly, Tostig could tell Harald that England's main forces were concentrated in the south, watching for a Norman invasion. The entire English strategy was predicated on defending against William of Normandy. An attack from the north would catch Harald Godwinson completely off balance. For Harald Hardrada, the temptation was overwhelming. Here was a chance to win a kingdom, to crown his career with the greatest conquest of all. The risks were substantial, certainly, but Harald had been taking risks his entire life. Moreover, at 51 years old, time was running out. If he was going to achieve immortal glory, it had to be now. There was also the matter of pride. Harald saw himself as the greatest warrior of his generation, perhaps of any generation. To die peacefully in bed, of old age or illness, would be a shameful end for such a man. Better to die in battle, attempting something magnificent. Better to gamble everything on one great throw of the dice. The two men reached an agreement. Harald would invade northern England with the full might of Norway. Tostig would join him with whatever forces he could muster and would guide the invasion. Together, they would overthrow Harald Godwinson and divide the kingdom. The details of how power would be shared were probably left vague. Ambitious men tend to avoid such specifics until after the victory. Through the summer of 1066, Harald prepared the greatest military expedition of his reign. He sent word throughout Norway, summoning warriors to assemble for a great enterprise. He called in favors, spent treasure, and used all his considerable powers of persuasion to gather an army. The response exceeded expectations. Warriors came not just from Norway, but from all across the Scandinavian world. Some were young men seeking glory and adventure. Others were veterans who remembered the old days of Viking conquest and wanted one more taste of that glory. Some came for loyalty to Harald, others for the promise of English gold. But they came. By late August, an enormous fleet had assembled in the Norwegian fjords. The sources speak of 300 ships, but this number is probably rounded and symbolic. What's clear is that this was the largest Viking fleet seen in decades, perhaps the largest since Cnut's conquest of England 50 years earlier. The ships themselves were works of art and engineering. The dragon ships, the great longships, were sleek and deadly, capable of crossing open ocean or navigating shallow rivers. They were powered by both sail and oar, giving them remarkable flexibility. A skilled crew could achieve impressive speeds, and the shallow draft meant they could beach almost anywhere. But this expedition also included Nars, broader, deeper cargo ships designed to carry horses, supplies, and heavy equipment. Unlike simple raiding parties that could live off plunder, this was an army of conquest that needed logistics. Blacksmiths brought forges and tools. Provisions were loaded: dried fish, salted meat, flour, ale. This was planned as a campaign that might last months. The warriors themselves were the elite of the Viking world. Many wore mail shirts, expensive, effective armor that marked them as professional soldiers. They carried round shields painted with bright colors, making them easier to identify in the chaos of battle. Their weapons were works of craftsmanship, pattern-welded swords passed down through generations, axes balanced for both throwing and chopping, spears with leaf-shaped blades. Among them were the berserkers, warriors who worked themselves into a battle frenzy, supposedly immune to pain and fear. Modern historians debate whether berserkers were simply skilled warriors who psyched themselves up before combat, or whether they used drugs like mushrooms to induce altered states. Either way, they had a fearsome reputation. As the fleet prepared to sail, Harald Hardrada stood before his army and delivered a speech. The Norse kings were expected to be poets as well as warriors, and Harald did not disappoint. Though his exact words are lost, the sagas preserve the gist. He spoke of England's wealth, of the glory they would win, of the songs that would be sung about this great enterprise. He invoked the memory of past Norwegian kings who had ruled in England. He promised that they would return rich and victorious or die gloriously in the attempt. Then, with favorable winds filling their sails, the great fleet sailed west across the North Sea. The journey from Norway to England took the fleet through some of the most treacherous waters in Europe. The North Sea in September can be calm and beautiful, or it can be a hell of towering waves and howling winds. Harald's fleet was fortunate. They had decent weather for most of the crossing. The ships sailed in formation, maintaining visual contact with each other during daylight. At night, they either anchored in sheltered waters or maintained position using lanterns and horn signals. The skill required to keep 300 ships together over hundreds of miles of open ocean was considerable. It testified to the Vikings' unmatched seamanship. Their first landfall was in the Shetland Islands, the northernmost outposts of Scottish territory, but culturally and politically more Norse than Scottish. Here, the fleet took on fresh water and provisions. More importantly, Harald recruited additional warriors from the local Norse population. The Shetlanders had their own grievances against Scottish and English authority and were happy to join an expedition that promised plunder and glory. From Shetland, the fleet sailed to the Orkney Islands, another Norse-dominated region. The Earl of Orkney was Paul Thorfinnsson, who owed nominal allegiance to the Norwegian crown. Harald expected Paul's full support, and he got it. More men joined the fleet, and additional supplies were loaded. The fleet was now at its maximum strength. As they prepared for the final leg of the journey, Harald held council with his commanders. Tostig was there, as were Harald's most trusted Norwegian jarls and the Viking leaders who had joined the expedition. They reviewed their intelligence about England. King Harald Godwinson had indeed concentrated his forces in the south. The English army, particularly the elite housecarls, was positioned along the southern coast from Kent to Sussex, watching for William of Normandy. The northern defenses were much weaker, held primarily by local militias under the Earls Edwin and Morcar. Tostig argued for striking at York immediately. As the ancient capital of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, York had symbolic importance. Its capture would send a message that Norwegian rule was returning to England. Moreover, York was wealthy and could provide immense plunder to enrich the army. Harald agreed, but with a modification. Rather than a direct assault on York, which might prove costly if the defenders had time to prepare, they would land on the coast, secure a base of operations, and advance inland. This would allow them to gather intelligence, accumulate supplies, and give any potential English supporters time to join them. The decision made, the fleet set sail for the Yorkshire coast. In mid-September 1066, the weather along the English coast was unsettled. Fishermen in their small boats noticed unusually large swells rolling in from the north. Clouds gathered on the horizon. Animals behaved strangely, sensing something in the air. The old women in the coastal villages muttered about evil omens. Then one gray morning, the lookouts saw them. Sails, dozens of sails, then hundreds of sails. The sea itself seemed to be coming alive with ships, an endless procession of dragon-prowed vessels bearing down on the English coast. The first target was Cleveland, a stretch of coast in what is now North Yorkshire. The Viking ships beached, and warriors poured ashore. The local villagers had no hope of resistance. They were fishermen and farmers, not soldiers. Some fled inland, carrying whatever they could grab. Others submitted immediately, hoping that cooperation would spare them the worst. Harald's men took what they wanted: food, livestock, anything valuable that could be easily carried. They burned a few buildings to make their point, but did not slaughter indiscriminately. This was conquest, not mere raiding. Harald wanted to rule these lands, which meant he needed the people alive, albeit terrified and obedient. The fleet then moved south along the coast to Scarborough. This was a more substantial settlement, protected by a wooden fortress on the cliffs overlooking the harbor. The local lord, whose name is lost to history, decided to resist. He had perhaps 200 men-at-arms, including both trained soldiers and armed townsmen. They barricaded themselves in the fortress and prepared to hold out. Harald Hardrada was not pleased. Resistance was not part of the plan. He wanted a quick, overwhelming demonstration of power that would persuade all of northern England to submit without fighting. Scarborough's defiance threatened to slow the momentum of the invasion, so Harald decided to make an example. He ordered his men to build an enormous pyre against the fortress's wooden walls. Trees were felled, timber gathered, oil and pitch brought from the ships. The defenders watched in growing horror as the Vikings constructed a bonfire 20 feet high directly against their walls. When all was ready, Harald had the pyre lit. The flames caught quickly, roaring up with intense heat. The wooden fortress, dry from a summer of little rain, caught fire almost immediately. Within minutes, the entire structure was ablaze. The defenders had no choice but to flee or burn. Most chose to flee, scrambling down the cliffs and surrendering to the Vikings. Harald's vengeance was terrible. Every man who had borne arms in the fortress's defense was executed. The chronicles say they were beheaded on the beach, their bodies left to the tide. The women and children were spared but enslaved. The town itself was thoroughly plundered, then partially burned. The message was clear: submit immediately, and you might be treated reasonably. Resist, and you will be utterly destroyed. It was classic Viking psychological warfare, and it was effective. News of Scarborough's fate spread rapidly along the coast and inland. Other towns and villages prepared to surrender rather than share Scarborough's doom. From Scarborough, the fleet sailed into the mouth of the River Humber, the great estuary that provided access to the interior of northern England. This was a remarkable feat of navigation. The Humber is tidal, with strong currents and shifting sandbanks. Navigating it with hundreds of ships required expert piloting, but the Vikings had sailed these waters before. During the age of the Danelaw, 2 centuries earlier, Viking fleets had routinely used the Humber to strike deep into England. Some of Harald's pilots were men who had sailed there before, or who had learned the waters from their fathers and grandfathers. They guided the fleet safely through. The sight of 300 Viking ships sailing up the Humber must have been awesome and terrible. Farmers working in fields along the banks stopped to stare in horror. Priests in village churches rang bells in alarm. Messengers galloped off in all directions, carrying the dreadful news. The Vikings had come in force, and they were sailing toward the heart of Northumbria. The fleet proceeded up the River Ouse, a tributary of the Humber that led directly to York. This was an even more impressive navigational achievement. The Ouse is narrower than the Humber, with more difficult currents. Yet the Vikings navigated it successfully, their ships spreading out along miles of river, a dragon-scaled serpent winding through the English countryside. Along the way, they raided and plundered. Riverside villages were stripped of food and valuables. Livestock was slaughtered to feed the army. Any resistance was crushed with overwhelming force. The Vikings were a locust swarm, consuming everything in their path. But Harald also showed occasional mercy and shrewd calculation. When villages surrendered immediately and provided guides and supplies, they were treated relatively well. Harald understood that he needed local cooperation if he was to hold this territory. Terror had its place, but so did calculated clemency. As the Viking fleet sailed up the Ouse, the English were desperately trying to organize a defense. The responsibility fell primarily on 2 young men, Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, Earl of Northumbria. Edwin was the elder, at 19 years old. He was intelligent and politically astute, but had little military experience. His earldom of Mercia was vast and wealthy, covering the English Midlands, but it was not well prepared for war. Edwin had to raise an army quickly from a population that had known peace for years. Morcar was even younger, having only recently become Earl of Northumbria in place of the exiled Tostig. He was barely 18 years old, thrust into a position of enormous responsibility. The Northumbrians had supported his appointment specifically because they hoped for lighter rule than Tostig had provided. Now Morcar had to lead them in battle against the most fearsome warriors in Europe. The two brothers conferred urgently. Messengers had already been sent south to King Harald, but it would take days for the news to reach London and more days for Harald to march north with reinforcements. In the meantime, Edwin and Morcar had to hold as long as they could. They decided to make their stand at Fulford, a village about 2 miles south of York. The location had several tactical advantages. The River Ouse was on one flank, and there was marshy ground on the other, which would restrict the Vikings' ability to outflank the English position. A raised road or causeway ran through the position, providing solid ground for the English to form their battle line. The English army that gathered at Fulford numbered perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 men. These were primarily members of the Fyrd, the militia levy that could be called up in times of emergency. They were free men with some military training and their own weapons, but they were not professional soldiers. Few had ever fought in a real battle. There were also some housecarls, the professional warriors who served the earls personally. These men were the equivalent of the Viking elite, equipped with mail armor and trained in formation fighting, but there were far too few of them. Edwin and Morcar together could field perhaps 200 or 300 housecarls compared to the thousands of veteran warriors in Harold's army. Despite these disadvantages, English morale was relatively high. They were defending their homes and families against foreign invaders. They had the advantage of a defensive position, and they had faith that their cause was just. These Vikings were pagans come to rape and pillage Christian England. The English took their position on the morning of September 20th. They formed a shield wall across the causeway, the standard defensive formation of the era. Each man held his shield so that it overlapped with his neighbor's, creating a continuous wall. Spears projected from gaps in the shields, creating a bristling hedge of points. Behind the shield wall stood archers and men with throwing weapons. In the rear were the commanders on horseback, ready to move reserves to wherever they were needed most. It was a sound defensive arrangement, given the forces available. As the sun climbed higher, the Vikings appeared. Harald Hardrada led his army in person, as was expected of a Viking king. He had left the ships a few miles downstream, guarded by a small force, and marched overland with his main army. The warriors came in loose formation, organized by ship crews and regional groups. Their shields bore a variety of colors and designs, creating a rainbow effect as they advanced. When the Vikings saw the English position, Harald called a halt to assess the situation. He was an experienced commander who had fought in dozens of battles across 3 continents. He understood immediately what the English were trying to do: use the terrain to negate the Vikings' superior numbers and combat skills. Harald had options. He could attempt a direct frontal assault on the English shield wall, but this would be costly. Shield walls were hard to break, and even elite troops could be held by determined defenders in a good position. Alternatively, he could try to outflank the English position, but the marshy ground made this difficult. Harald chose a third option: a combination attack. He would send part of his force in a frontal assault to pin the English in place, while another force worked its way around the marshy ground to attack the English flank. It would take time and coordination, but it offered the best chance of victory with acceptable casualties. The battle began with a Viking advance. The front ranks of Harald's army marched forward steadily, shields locked, maintaining formation. As they came into range, English archers let fly. Arrows whistled through the air, striking shields and occasionally finding gaps to wound or kill Vikings. The advance continued without pause. When the 2 shield walls met, the real killing began. The front ranks pressed against each other, each side trying to push the other back. Spears stabbed over and through the shields. Men screamed in pain and rage. The ground grew slippery with blood. The English held. The housecarls in the front ranks were skilled warriors, and the Fyrd behind them was bolstered by desperation and the knowledge that there was nowhere to retreat. For perhaps half an hour, the battle hung in balance. neither side able to gain advantage. Then Harold's flanking force arrived. They had worked their way through the marshy ground, losing some men to the treacherous footing, but succeeding in reaching the English flank. Now they crashed into the side of the English line, where the defenders were weakest. The English formation began to buckle. Men turned to face the new threat, breaking the integrity of the shield wall. The Vikings in front immediately pressed their advantage, pushing forward wherever gaps appeared. The disciplined battle line began to dissolve into a confused melee. Edwin and Morcar, watching from their command position, saw their army disintegrating. They tried to organize a fighting withdrawal, to pull their men back in some kind of order. But the Fyrd, facing professional warriors for the first time, began to panic. What had been an organized retreat became a rout. Men threw down their shields and ran. The Vikings pursued, cutting down the fleeing English without mercy. The ditch that bordered the road became a death trap. English soldiers tumbled into it in their panic, landing on top of each other. The Vikings followed them in, or stood at the edges, stabbing down at the trapped men. The chronicles record that so many bodies piled up in the ditch that it could be crossed on the corpses. This is probably an exaggeration, but it captures the horror of what happened. Hundreds of English soldiers died in that ditch, drowning in the mix of mud, water, and blood, or crushed by the weight of bodies on top of them. Edwin and Morcar barely escaped with their lives. Their housecarls formed a protective ring and fought their way out of the disaster, losing many men in the process. The two young earls fled north toward York, their army destroyed, their confidence shattered. The Vikings had won a complete victory. English casualties were probably around 2,000 killed or seriously wounded. Viking losses were relatively light, perhaps a few hundred. More importantly, the only organized English force in the north had been annihilated. The road to York lay open. York in 1066 was one of the most important cities in England. With a population of perhaps 10,000 people, it was second only to London in size and wealth. It had been the capital of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik for generations before being reintegrated into England. The city still had a significant population of Norse descent, people who spoke both English and Norse, who remembered the old days of Viking rule with a certain nostalgia. The city's defenses were formidable. Ancient Roman walls, built of stone and still largely intact, encircled the city center. These walls had been maintained and in some places strengthened over the centuries. Within the walls were numerous churches, markets, workshops, and wealthy homes. The city was a center of trade and craftsmanship, but walls were only as strong as the will to defend them. After the disaster at Fulford, York had no army. The city militia, composed of craftsmen and merchants, had no hope of resisting Harald Hardrada's battle-hardened warriors. The citizens of York faced a terrible choice: resist and see their city destroyed, or surrender and hope for mercy. The city's leading citizens, the archbishop, the wealthy merchants, the nobles whose estates surrounded the city, met in emergency council. The debate was anguished. Some argued for resistance, saying it was better to die free than live as slaves to Viking pagans. Others pointed out that Harald was technically Christian, having been baptized in his youth, even if his Christianity was of the rough Scandinavian variety. The pragmatists won the argument. York would surrender on the best terms it could negotiate. A delegation rode out to meet Harald Hardrada. They found him camped with his army a few miles south of the city, at the village of Recall, where his ships were anchored. The contrast between the English delegates in their fine robes and the Vikings in their war gear must have been striking. Harald received the delegation courteously. He was, after all, proposing to become their king, not just their conqueror. He listened to their formal surrender, then laid out his terms. York would not be sacked or burned. The citizens' lives and property would be protected. The churches would be respected. There would be no repeat of the monastery burnings of earlier Viking ages. In exchange, York would provide supplies for the Norwegian army and would hand over hostages to guarantee good behavior. More significantly, the city would acknowledge Harald as King of England and provide support for his conquest of the rest of the realm. This was crucial. Harald needed York as a base of operations and as a symbol. If the ancient Viking capital accepted him, it would encourage others to do the same. The terms were generous by the standards of the time, and the delegates accepted them. Arrangements were made for the formal exchange of hostages and the delivery of supplies. The meeting would take place at Stamford Bridge, a village about 15 kilometers east of York on the River Derwent. Stamford Bridge was chosen for practical reasons. It was a traditional meeting place, a neutral ground where neither side would feel disadvantaged. The bridge itself was an important crossing point on one of the main roads in the region. It had a village nearby that could provide facilities for the negotiations. The date was set for September 25th. Both sides would come with modest escorts. This was to be a diplomatic meeting, not a military confrontation. Harald agreed to leave the bulk of his army at Rickhall with the ships. The English would ensure that no armed forces from York interfered with the proceedings. Having secured York's submission without a fight, Harald Hardrada must have felt triumphant. The invasion was proceeding exactly as planned. Northern England was falling into his hands with minimal losses. Once he secured York as his base, he could march south and confront Harold Godwinson's army on his own terms. What Harald did not know was that Harold Godwinson was already marching north with terrible speed, driving his men to their limits, determined to catch the Vikings before they could consolidate their position. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic surprises. When the news of the Viking invasion reached London, King Harold Godwinson was in a state of high alert, but watching the wrong direction. For weeks, he had been expecting William of Normandy to invade from the south. He had kept his army mobilized along the southern coast, ships ready to intercept any Norman fleet, spies in Normandy reporting on William's preparations. The intelligence from the north hit him like a physical blow. Harald Hardrada, not some minor raider, but the most dangerous warrior king in Christendom, had invaded with a massive army. They had defeated Edwin and Morcar at Fulford. York was negotiating surrender. The entire north of England was on the verge of falling to the Vikings, and his brother Tostig was with them. That betrayal cut deeply. Harald had hoped Tostig's earlier raids were just the impotent fury of an exile. But this was a dagger aimed at the heart of England, guided by someone who knew all of England's weaknesses. Harald faced an agonizing strategic dilemma. If he marched north with his army, he would leave the south undefended. William of Normandy could land unopposed and march on London. But if he stayed in the south, Harald Hardrada would conquer the north, establish himself in York, and march south with ever-growing forces as English nobles decided to back the winner. There was really only one choice. Harald had to march north immediately and destroy the Viking threat before it could grow stronger. He would have to gamble that the autumn weather would keep William bottled up in Normandy for a few more weeks. Harald summoned his commanders and explained the situation. They would march north with the housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the core of the English army. These were men who had trained together for years, who could maintain discipline on a forced march and in battle. The Fyrd would be left to guard the south as best they could. The march that followed was an extraordinary feat of determination and logistics. The distance from London to York was approximately 300 kilometers. Medieval armies typically marched about 15 to 20 kilometers per day, meaning a journey of 2 weeks or more. Harold's army covered the distance in 6 days. They marched from dawn to dusk, sometimes beyond. They slept for a few hours, then rose and marched again. They lived on cold food eaten on the move. Men's feet blistered and bled. Horses went lame. Equipment was discarded to save weight. But they kept moving. Harald set the pace himself, riding at the front, visible to his men, sharing their hardships. He knew that every hour counted. The longer Harald Hardrada had to consolidate his position in York, the harder it would be to dislodge him. As they marched, Harald sent messengers ahead to rally local forces. Every shire they passed through was ordered to send its militia to join the royal army. Men left their plows in the fields and grabbed whatever weapons they had. By the time Harald reached Yorkshire, his force had swelled considerably, though many of the new recruits were poorly armed and exhausted. On the evening of September 24th, Harold's vanguard reached York. The city had not yet formally submitted to the Vikings. The hostage exchange was scheduled for the next day at Stamford Bridge. The citizens, caught between two armies, didn't know whether to celebrate or panic at the English army's arrival. Harald met with Edwin and Morcar. The two young earls were ashamed of their defeat at Fulford and eager to redeem themselves. They provided Harald with detailed intelligence about the Viking forces. how many ships they had, where they were camped, what their movements had been. Most importantly, they told Harald about the scheduled meeting at Stamford Bridge the next day. Harald Hardrada would be there with a substantial force, but not his entire army. Many Vikings would be left guarding the ships at Rickel. The Norwegian king would not be expecting a battle. He thought he was attending a peaceful negotiation. Harald saw his opportunity immediately. If he could march to Stamford Bridge and catch the Vikings by surprise, he could destroy a large part of their army before they could organize a defense. It was exactly the kind of bold, aggressive tactic that had made Harald Hardrada famous. Now it would be used against him. That night, while the Vikings at Stamford Bridge settled in for a peaceful evening before the next day's negotiations, Harald's army rested in York, checking weapons, preparing for battle. Few men slept. They knew that the next day would bring either glorious victory or terrible death. September 25th, 1066, dawned unseasonably warm. The early morning mist that often blanketed the Yorkshire dales burned off quickly, revealing a bright blue sky. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind of late summer weather that makes one grateful to be alive. At Stamford Bridge, the Vikings were in good spirits. Many had left their heavy armor back at the ships in Rickel. Why wear uncomfortable mail on a hot day when you're just going to a diplomatic meeting? They wore tunics, trousers, and boots. They carried their personal weapons, swords at their belts, perhaps a spear or axe, but shields and helmets were left behind. Harald Hardrada himself wore his favorite blue tunic. He carried his sword, a magnificent weapon with a silver-inlaid hilt that he had owned for decades, but he had left his mail coat on his ship. Some of his commanders questioned this decision, but Harald was confident. What could go wrong at a simple hostage exchange? Tostig Godwinson was there too. He knew his brother Harald better than Harald did, and some part of him was uneasy. Harald was not the type to accept the loss of the North without a fight. But surely Harald was still in the south, watching for William of Normandy. Surely he couldn't have marched north this quickly. The Norwegian army, or at least the portion that had come to Stamford Bridge, spread out across the meadows on both sides of the River Derwent. Warriors chatted, played dice, told stories. Some waded in the river to cool off. A few practiced with their weapons, keeping their skills sharp. It was a relaxed, almost festive atmosphere. The bridge itself was a wooden structure, narrow enough that only 2 or 3 men could cross abreast. It was a choke point, which in a defensive situation could be very valuable. But the Vikings weren't thinking defensively. They were scattered across both banks of the river, not concentrated in a defensive formation. Around noon, someone pointed to the western horizon. A cloud of dust was rising, the kind of dust cloud raised by a large group of mounted men moving fast. The Vikings watched with mild curiosity. Perhaps it was the York delegation coming for the hostage exchange? But the cloud grew larger and larger still. This was not a diplomatic delegation. This was an army. The terrible realization swept through the Viking camp. Horns blew urgent warnings. Officers shouted orders. Warriors scrambled for their weapons. The relaxed camp exploded into frantic activity. Harald Hardrada stood on high ground, watching the approaching army. Even at this distance, he could see the banners. The banner of Wessex, the personal standard of the English king. Harald Godwinson had come, and he had come in force. For just a moment, Harald must have felt a cold shock of fear. He had been outmaneuvered, caught completely off guard. His army was divided, with half his force miles away at Rickel. His men were without armor, scattered, unprepared for battle. But Harald Hardrada had not become the most feared warrior of his age by giving in to fear. He was in a desperate situation, but he had been in desperate situations before and survived through courage and leadership. He began shouting orders, rallying his men, organizing a defense. The Vikings began forming their shield wall, the classic defensive formation. But it was a hurried, improvised version. Many men had no shields and had to make do with whatever they could grab. The formation was thin in places, overcrowded in others. It would have to do. Tostig rode up beside Harald. "I know him," Tostig said, pointing toward the advancing English army. "That's my brother. He's come to kill us both." Harald looked at his ally. "Your brother is a brave man to come so far so fast. Let's give him the battle he's looking for." As the English army deployed for battle, a single horseman rode out from their ranks and approached the Viking lines. He came alone, unarmed except for a sword at his belt, his horse walking slowly. It was a calculated display of either bravery or bravado. The Vikings watched him come, weapons ready. The rider stopped just outside spear range and called out, asking to speak with Tostig Godwinson. Tostig rode forward to meet him, curious. When he got close enough to see the rider's face, he froze. The rider was Harald Godwinson himself, the King of England, his brother. The conversation that followed was recorded by several chroniclers, though the exact words vary between accounts. The essence is clear enough. Harald, I offer you pardon, brother. Return your earldom of Northumbria. All can be as it was before. You need not die today. Tostig was silent for a long moment, clearly conflicted. Here was his brother offering him everything back. All he had to do was betray Harald Hardrada and return to Harald's side. Tostig, and what of King Harald of Norway? What do you offer him? Harald's reply has echoed through history. He looked past Tostig to where Harald Hardrada stood, watching the parley. Harald, 7 feet of English ground, or perhaps a little more, since he is taller than most men. It was a death sentence delivered with grim humor. Harald Hardrada would get exactly enough English earth to make his grave, and not an inch more. Tostig's face hardened. He had made his choice when he allied with the Norwegians. Pride and hatred would not allow him to go back now. Tostig, then we fight. You won't find us easy prey, brother. The rider turned his horse and began riding back to the English lines. Tostig returned to the Viking camp. Harald Hardrada asked what had been said, and Tostig explained the offer. Harald reportedly smiled. 7 feet of ground, or a little more. Your brother has wit, I'll give him that, but wit won't save him today. Then Harald Hardrada began the speech that would be his last. He addressed his warriors, his voice carrying across the meadow. The saga writers later embellished his words, but the core message was simple. They were Vikings, warriors who feared nothing. They had conquered from Byzantium to England. They would not be defeated by an upstart English king who had never known true battle. The warriors roared their approval, beating weapons on shields. If they were going to die, they would die as Vikings should, fighting. Both armies were now in position. The English had perhaps 5,000 men, including Harald's elite housecarls and the local militia forces gathered during the march north. The Vikings had perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 at Stamford Bridge, though scattered on both sides of the river and lacking much of their armor. Harald Godwinson, commanding from horseback, gave the order. The English army began its advance. As the English army approached, both sides faced an immediate tactical problem: the bridge itself. Most of the Viking force was on the east bank of the river Derwent, while the English were advancing from the west. To come to grips with the main Viking army, the English would have to cross that narrow wooden bridge. Harald Hardrada had posted a small force on the west bank to delay the English as long as possible. These were warriors who had managed to grab shields and weapons, perhaps 100 men. They formed a shield wall blocking the bridge approach. The English hit them like a hammer. The housecarls, wielding their fearsome Danish axes, smashed into the thin Viking line. These axes were two-handed weapons, heavy enough to split shields and crush helmets. Against unarmored opponents, they were devastating. The Vikings on the west bank fought with desperate courage, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Within minutes, most were dead or dying. The few survivors tried to flee across the bridge to the main army. But then something extraordinary happened. One Viking warrior, whose name has been lost to history, took position on the bridge itself. He was a berserker, one of the legendary Norse warriors who fought in a trance-like battle fury. Clad in mail armor that he had somehow managed to find, wielding a huge two-handed axe, he blocked the bridge and defied the entire English army to get past him. The first English soldiers to reach the bridge tried to push past him. The berserker's axe lashed out, and the first man fell, nearly cut in two. The next soldier tried to rush past while the Viking's axe was low, but the berserker somehow reversed the weapon and caught him with the axe head on the backswing, caving in his helmet. More housecarls pressed forward. The bridge was so narrow they could only come at him 2 or 3 at a time. and the berserker was a whirlwind of violence. His axe never seemed to stop moving. Men fell with crushed skulls, severed limbs, terrible wounds to the torso. Bodies began to pile up on the bridge. For perhaps 40 minutes, an eternity in combat, this single warrior held the bridge. Chronicles claim he killed 40 Englishmen, though the actual number was probably lower. Still, it was an extraordinary feat of arms. The English tried everything. Archers shot at him, but most arrows either missed or stuck harmlessly in his mail. Spearmen tried to stab him from just outside the reach of his axe, but he was too quick, too skilled. The bodies of the slain actually helped him by creating obstacles that hindered attackers. Meanwhile, on the east bank, Harald Hardrada was using this precious time to organize his defenses. The scattered Vikings were forming into a proper shield wall. Runners had been sent to Harald to summon the rest of the army, though they would take hours to arrive. If the berserker on the bridge could hold just a little longer, but the English finally found a solution. One soldier, either very brave or very clever, grabbed a large wooden tub or barrel. He got into the river upstream from the bridge and floated down beneath it. The river was shallow enough to wade, and the bridge had gaps between the planks. From his position directly under the bridge, the English soldier could look up and see the berserker's feet and legs between the planks. He took his spear and thrust upward through a gap. The spear caught the Viking in the groin or lower abdomen, accounts vary, inflicting a mortal wound. The berserker fell, his blood pouring through the bridge planks into the river below. He had bought Harald Hardrada as much time as one man could, but now the way was clear. The English army poured across the bridge. On the east bank of the Derwent, Harald Hardrada had managed to form his army into something resembling proper battle order. The classic Viking shield wall stretched across the meadow, overlapping shields, spears projecting through the gaps, the best warriors at the critical points. But it was far from the usual standard. Many warriors had no shields and held their helmets or pieces of wood in front of themselves. The male armored elite were mixed in with men wearing nothing more than tunics. The formation had gaps and weak points. Harald himself took position at the center of the line, the place of greatest honor and danger. His personal banner, Land Waster, flew above him, a black raven on a white field. According to Norse tradition, this banner brought victory to whoever carried it, but death to whoever raised it in battle. Harald had raised it knowing full well the prophecy. Tostig Godwinson commanded one of the flanks. Despite everything, despite his hatred of his brother Harald, Tostig was an experienced warrior. He organized his section of the line competently, encouraging the men, shoring up weak points. The English army, now across the bridge, deployed for assault. Harald Godwinson arrayed his forces with his housecarls, the professional warriors who were the equal of any Vikings at the front. Behind them came the feared soldiers and the northern militia. The English had a significant advantage in numbers now, and they were prepared for battle while the Vikings had been caught by surprise. Harald gave the order to advance. The English moved forward in a controlled march, maintaining their formation. When they came within range, English archers loosed their arrows. The Vikings, many without shields, suffered casualties even before the hand-to-hand fighting began. Then the two shield walls collided with a tremendous crash. The sound of shields slamming together, of weapons striking wood and metal, of men shouting in rage and pain, it created a noise like thunder. This was the reality of medieval combat: brutal, exhausting, terrifying. The initial impact favored neither side. The Vikings, despite their disadvantages, were veterans who had fought in countless battles. They knew how to maintain a shield wall under pressure. The English housecarls, equally experienced, pushed hard but could not break through. For perhaps 30 minutes, the two sides ground against each other. Men in the front ranks stabbed with spears over and around shields. Those with axes tried to hook shields and pull them aside to create openings. The wounded fell and were dragged back by comrades. Fresh warriors stepped into the line. This was a battle of attrition. Whichever side could maintain discipline and endure the longest would win. And gradually, the English numbers began to tell. They could rotate fresh troops into the line while the Vikings had no reserves. English pressure on the Viking flanks began to push them back. Harald Hardrada, watching from his position in the center, saw what was happening. The line was holding for now, but it couldn't hold forever. If only the reinforcements from Harald would arrive. Then an English arrow, shot high to arc over the front ranks, came down at a steep angle. It struck Harald Hardrada in the throat, piercing through the flesh and into his windpipe. The great king, the terror of Europe, fell. The death of Harald Hardrada could have broken the Viking army's morale completely. Their king, their leader, the man they had followed across the North Sea, was dead. Without him, what were they fighting for? But the Vikings did not break. Tostig Godwinson immediately took command, shouting orders, rallying the men. These were professionals who understood that breaking in battle meant death. Their only hope was to hold the line and pray for the reinforcements to arrive. And then, like a miracle, those reinforcements appeared. Eystein Orr, Harald's brother-in-law, had been left in command at Recall with the rest of the army. When the messengers arrived with news of the battle, Eystein immediately gathered every warrior he could and set off for Stamford Bridge at a run. It was approximately 25 kilometers from Recall to Stamford Bridge. Eystein's warriors ran that distance wearing their full armor, mail coats that weighed 30 pounds or more, helmets, shields, weapons. In the unseasonable heat of that September day, it was a brutal ordeal. Many warriors collapsed from heat exhaustion before reaching the battlefield. Others fell out, unable to keep pace. But those who made it, perhaps 1,000 or 1,500 men, arrived in fighting condition, fresh and fully armed. The arrival of Eystein's force transformed the battle. These warriors crashed into the English flank with tremendous force. The English, who had been steadily pushing the Vikings back, suddenly found themselves under assault from an unexpected direction. This attack has come down in history as Orry's Storm, a furious, desperate assault that temporarily turned the tide. The English line buckled under the impact. For a brief time, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, the outcome of the battle was in doubt again. Eystein Orr fought like a man possessed. He was trying to avenge Harald's death, to salvage something from this disaster. His warriors, enraged by what had happened to their king, fought with reckless courage. They pushed the English back, step by bloody step, but courage was not enough. Eystein's men were exhausted from their run. Many were already suffering from heat stroke, barely able to stand, and they were too few. The English army, though shaken, was still larger and included many fresh troops who had not yet been fully engaged. Harald Godwinson reorganized his forces and threw them at Eystein's warriors. The English housecarls, wielding their terrible axes, carved into the Norwegian ranks. Eystein himself, fighting in the front ranks as a Viking leader should, was struck down by multiple weapons. He fell, his body covered in wounds. With Eystein's death, the last organized Viking resistance collapsed. The shield wall, already weakened, finally shattered. Individual warriors or small groups tried to fight on, but they were surrounded and cut down. The battle became a massacre. What followed was one of the most complete military annihilations in medieval history. The Viking army didn't just lose the battle, it was almost entirely destroyed. Those warriors who could fled toward the ships at Recall. But they were pursued by English cavalry who had been held in reserve during the main battle and now were unleashed to hunt down the fugitives. The exhausted, mostly unarmored Vikings had no chance. The countryside became a killing ground. Vikings were cut down in fields and forests along roads. Some tried to hide, but local English peasants, who had suffered from Viking raids, helped the soldiers find them. No quarter was given. Many Vikings drowned trying to cross the various streams and ditches that crisscrossed the landscape. Exhausted men in heavy armor simply sank beneath the water. Others got stuck in marshy ground and were overtaken by their pursuers. A few small groups managed to organize defensive stands, backing up against trees or forming small shield walls. These were overwhelmed by superior numbers. The English were merciless. These invaders had come to conquer England, and they would pay the price. Some Vikings did make it back to the ships at Recall. They scrambled aboard, cut the mooring lines, and tried to escape down the river. A few managed it, but many ships ran aground on the unfamiliar river or were caught by English forces. Tostig Godwinson was among the dead. He fell fighting, refusing to surrender even when the battle was clearly lost. His body was found among the last defenders, surrounded by the bodies of the men who had died trying to protect him. Harald Godwinson reportedly wept when he saw his brother's corpse. Whatever their political differences, they had been brothers, raised together, sharing childhood memories. That bond, even broken by war, still meant something. As evening fell on September 25th, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. The field around Stamford Bridge was covered with bodies. Estimates of Viking dead ranged from 8 to 10,000 warriors, essentially the entire invasion force. English casualties were also significant, perhaps 2,000 killed or wounded. But the English could afford these losses while the Vikings could not. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge was a scene of carnage that shocked even the battle-hardened soldiers who witnessed it. Bodies lay in heaps where the fighting had been thickest. The river ran red with blood. Wounded men cried out for help, for water, for death. Harald Godwinson's first task was to separate the English and Viking dead. The English were to be given proper Christian burial. Priests moved among the bodies, offering last rites to those still living and blessing the dead. Families from nearby villages came to search for their men among the fallen. The Viking dead presented a different problem. There were simply too many for individual burial, and in any case they were pagan invaders who had come to conquer Christian England. Mass graves were dug, and the bodies were rolled into them without ceremony. Some English priests objected to this treatment. Even pagans deserved proper burial, they argued, but practical necessity overruled theological nicety. Among the Norwegian nobility, however, some were given better treatment. Harald Hardrada's body was found, identified by his unusual height and the quality of his equipment. Despite being an enemy, he was a king, and certain courtesies were observed. His body was prepared for transport to be eventually returned to Norway. The wealth left on the battlefield was extraordinary. Vikings went to war wearing and carrying their most valuable possessions: gold and silver arm rings, silver inlaid weapons, jewelry, coins. All of this was collected by the English victors. Much of it ended up in Harald Godwinson's war chest, where it would help finance his upcoming battle with William of Normandy. The ships at Rickel were a prize in themselves. Of the 300 vessels that had brought the invasion force, most were now without crews. Harald ordered some burned to prevent any remaining Vikings from using them. Others were seized and added to the English fleet, but many were simply left to rot, too numerous to be worth salvaging. The survivors were a pitiful remnant. Of the 8 to 10,000 warriors who had sailed from Norway, perhaps 500 to 1,000 survived. Many were wounded, all were traumatized. These men had seen their king killed, their army destroyed, their great enterprise turned to ashes. Harald Godwinson allowed them to leave. This was partially mercy. They posed no further threat, but also calculation. These men would return to Norway and spread the story of what had happened to those who dared invade England. They would be living warnings. The Chronicle reports that only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. This number has symbolic power, representing the scale of the Norwegian defeat. 300 ships had come in conquest. 24 returned in shame. Among the survivors was Olaf Haraldsson, Harald's 16-year-old son. He had been left with the ships during the battle and had thus escaped the slaughter. Now he was king of Norway, inheriting a realm shocked by the loss of so many warriors and the humiliation of such a defeat. Harald Godwinson met with young Olaf before allowing him to depart. The conversation between them is not recorded, but Harald presumably extracted promises that Norway would never again threaten England. Olaf, traumatized by his father's death and the destruction of the army, must have been eager to agree to anything that would let him go home. As the surviving Norwegian ships limped down the Ouse, then the Humber, and finally out into the North Sea, they left behind a changed world. The Viking Age, which had begun with the Lindisfarne raid in 793, effectively ended at Stamford Bridge in 1066. In the immediate aftermath of Stamford Bridge, Harald Godwinson stood at the pinnacle of his power and prestige. He had accomplished something no English king had done in generations. He had utterly destroyed a major Viking invasion force. The victory was celebrated throughout England. Churches held services of thanksgiving. Priests preached that God had granted the English victory over the pagan invaders. Harald was hailed as a worthy successor to Alfred the Great, the legendary king who had fought off the Vikings 2 centuries earlier. In York, the citizens, who had been preparing to submit to Harald Hardrada, now welcomed Harald Godwinson as their savior. The city held a feast in the king's honor. Wealthy merchants presented gifts. The archbishop blessed the king and prayed for his continued success. But Harald could not afford to linger in celebration. Even as his men were still counting the dead at Stamford Bridge, messengers arrived from the south with dire news. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey on September 28th, only 3 days after Stamford Bridge. The weather that had kept William penned in Normandy for weeks had finally changed. The winds that had blown from the north, preventing a channel crossing, had shifted. William's fleet had crossed without opposition. The English navy that should have been guarding the coast was scattered or destroyed, many ships having been lost in storms earlier in the month. William had landed with an army estimated at 7,000 to 10,000 men, including perhaps 2,000 cavalry. These were not militia, but professional warriors, Norman knights, mercenaries from across Europe, adventurers seeking land and glory. They were well-equipped, well-trained, and led by one of the most capable commanders in Europe. Harald faced a terrible dilemma. His army was exhausted from the forced march north and the brutal battle at Stamford Bridge. Many of his best warriors had been killed or wounded. His men desperately needed rest, time to recover their strength. But William was ravaging Sussex, the very heart of Harald's own earldom of Wessex. Norman raiding parties were burning villages and stealing livestock. This was not just a military threat, but a personal insult. William was deliberately devastating Harald's own lands to provoke him into hasty action. Harald made the decision that would determine his fate. He would march south immediately and confront William before the Norman could consolidate his position. It was the same aggressive strategy that had worked so brilliantly at Stamford Bridge. Harald would give William no time to prepare, no opportunity to gather local support or build fortifications. On October 1st, barely a week after Stamford Bridge, Harald's army began its march south. It was another forced march, another desperate race against time. Once again, Harald was asking his men for the impossible, to cover hundreds of kilometers at maximum speed, with no time for rest or recovery. The march from York to London, and then from London to Hastings, was an ordeal that broke many men. The housecarls, professional warriors who took pride in their endurance, drove themselves forward through sheer discipline. But the levies from the northern counties, already exhausted from the earlier march in the battle, began to fall out in large numbers. Some men simply collapsed from exhaustion and had to be left behind. Others developed injuries, bad feet, pulled muscles, more serious problems that made them unable to keep pace. Some deserted, deciding that they had done their duty at Stamford Bridge and owed nothing more. Harald could not afford to wait for stragglers. Every day of delay gave William more time to prepare. The king drove his army forward relentlessly, sacrificing completeness for speed. They reached London on October 5th or 6th. Accounts vary. Harald spent perhaps 2 days in the capital, gathering reinforcements, redistributing supplies, sending out calls for additional troops. But he could not wait long. Reports from the south indicated that William was methodically devastating Sussex, and Harald's political position required him to protect his own lands. On October 11th, Harald left London with his army and headed south toward the coast. He covered the approximately 90 kilometers to the area near Hastings in about 3 days, arriving on the evening of October 13th. His plan, apparently, was to repeat the Stamford Bridge strategy, arrive unexpectedly and attack before William was ready. Harald positioned his army on the road between William's position and London, blocking the Norman advance. He chose a defensive position on a ridge near a place called Senlac Hill, but this time, the surprise failed. William's scouts detected the English army's approach. Unlike Harald Hardrada, William was prepared for battle. The two armies would meet on October 14th in a clash that would decide the fate of England. The Battle of Hastings, which occurred less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, bears an eerie resemblance to the earlier battle, but with the roles reversed. At Stamford Bridge, Harald had caught Harald Hardrada by surprise, attacked with a fresh army against exhausted, unprepared defenders, and won a complete victory. At Hastings, it was Harald who was exhausted, whose army was depleted and unprepared. William attacked with a fresh, well-organized force, and after a full day of fighting, won a complete victory. Harold Godwinson died at Hastings, struck down in the battle's final phase. With him died the Anglo-Saxon monarchy that had ruled England for centuries. William of Normandy became William the Conqueror, King of England, founder of a new dynasty. The cruel irony was not lost on contemporaries. Harold had won the most complete victory over Vikings in English history, only to lose everything to a different invader 3 weeks later. If he had been able to rest his army, if he had waited a few more weeks before confronting William, the outcome might have been different. But we can never know. What we do know is that Stamford Bridge, despite being a brilliant English victory, helped cause the Norman conquest. The battle exhausted England's military power at the critical moment. The Vikings, even in defeat, had accomplished what they could not have done in victory. They had broken English strength and opened the way for William. The survivors of Stamford Bridge who sailed back to Norway carried with them a trauma that would mark Norwegian society for a generation. They returned to a kingdom that had sent out its best warriors and gotten back only broken remnants. The scale of the loss was staggering. Almost every notable family in Norway had lost men at Stamford Bridge. Some families lost entire generations, fathers and sons, brothers, cousins. The social fabric of Norwegian military aristocracy was shredded. Olaf Haraldsson, the new king, was a traumatized teenager thrust into power. He had watched his father die, had seen Norway's military might destroyed in a single afternoon. His first act as king was to make peace with Denmark, ending the long rivalry on any terms his opponent wanted. He had no stomach for continued conflict. Under Olaf's reign, Norway turned inward. The great age of Viking expansion was over. No more raids on foreign coasts, no more attempts at conquest. Norwegian warriors became farmers, traders, Christians. The transformation that had been happening gradually for decades accelerated after Stamford Bridge. In a sense, Stamford Bridge accomplished what centuries of resistance, fortifications, and counter-raids had failed to do. It ended the Viking Age. The death of Harald Hardrada and the destruction of his army removed the last great champion of the old ways. In England, Stamford Bridge was quickly overshadowed by the Norman conquest. The battle that should have been remembered as a great English victory became instead a footnote to a great English defeat. The site of the battle became a place of pilgrimage, but more for antiquarians than for patriots. Local folklore preserves stories of the giant Norwegian king and the brave berserker who held the bridge. But these were local memories, not national ones. For centuries after, English peasants plowing fields around Stamford Bridge would turn up bones, weapons, and jewelry. These grim reminders of the battle gradually disappeared, scattered or buried deeper by time. The village of Stamford Bridge itself prospered modestly. Its name ensured it would never be completely forgotten, though most people who knew the name had only vague notions of what had happened there. For military historians, Stamford Bridge became a case study in the importance of intelligence, surprise, and speed. Harold's rapid march and unexpected attack became the model for aggressive commanders. But the lesson was double-edged. The same tactics that won at Stamford Bridge contributed to the loss at Hastings. In Scandinavian memory, Stamford Bridge became something different. A tragedy, yes, but also a glorious last stand. The saga writers who preserved Norse oral traditions in written form transformed the disaster into an epic. Harald Hardrada became a legendary figure, the last of the great Viking kings. His death was seen as inevitable, even necessary, the fulfillment of prophecy, the end of an age. The sagas emphasized his courage, his skill, his refusal to surrender even when defeat was certain. The berserker who held the bridge became a folk hero. Different sagas give him different names, or no name at all, but all agree on his extraordinary courage. He embodied the Viking ideal, one man against impossible odds, fighting to the end. Even Tostig Godwinson, the traitor, was given a certain grudging respect in Norse sources. He had chosen loyalty to his ally over reconciliation with his brother. He had died fighting rather than accept a pardon that would have required betrayal. These were honorable choices by Viking standards. The Norwegian survivors who returned home became honored elders. They had participated in the last great Viking expedition. Their stories, told and retold, preserved memories of a world that was passing away. Stamford Bridge was part of a larger pattern of change sweeping across Europe in the 11th century. The fragmented, violent world of the early Middle Ages was giving way to more organized, centralized kingdoms. The Vikings had thrived in the chaos of the 9th and 10th centuries, when weak kingdoms and divided polities could not mount effective resistance. But by 1066, things had changed. England, though still divided by regional loyalties, could mobilize and deploy a professional army quickly. This was new. The Norman conquest itself, though catastrophic for Anglo-Saxon England, represented another step in this centralization process. William the Conqueror would build a more tightly controlled kingdom than any previous English king. Castles, bureaucracy, and Norman military organization would transform England into one of medieval Europe's strongest kingdoms. Scandinavia, too, was changing. Christianity was spreading, bringing with it continental models of kingship and organization. The Old Norse gods were giving way to the Christian god. The warrior culture that had produced the Vikings was being replaced by a more settled agricultural society. Stamford Bridge was thus not just a battle, but a symbolic marker, the point where one age ended and another began. It was the twilight of the Vikings and the dawn of the High Middle Ages. History is full of contingencies, moments where events could have gone differently and changed everything that followed. Stamford Bridge and its aftermath offer several such moments. What if Harald Hardrada had kept his army together instead of dividing it between Rickel and Stamford Bridge? A unified Norwegian force, even without armor, would have been much harder to defeat. Harold Godwinson might have been forced to besiege them rather than risk a pitched battle. This would have given William of Normandy more time to consolidate in the south. What if Harald Hardrada had worn his armor on September 25th? His death from an arrow to the throat was the turning point of the battle. With proper protection, he might have survived, and Norwegian resistance might have held until reinforcements arrived. What if Harold Godwinson had rested his army after Stamford Bridge instead of immediately marching south? If he had waited even 2 weeks, his forces would have been much stronger at Hastings. Would this have been enough to defeat William? We cannot know, but it would certainly have given the English a better chance. What if William of Normandy had been delayed another month by bad weather? Harold could have dealt with the Norwegian threat, rested his army, and been in a much better position to face the Norman invasion. England might have remained Anglo-Saxon. These questions are ultimately unanswerable, but they remind us how contingent historical outcomes can be. Small decisions, like Harold choosing not to wear his armor, can have enormous consequences. From a purely military standpoint, Stamford Bridge offers several timeless lessons. First, intelligence and surprise are often more valuable than numbers or equipment. Harold's rapid march caught Harald Hardrada completely off guard, negating the Norwegian advantages in experience and warrior quality. Second, concentration of force matters enormously. Harold's decision to divide his army proved fatal. Even the best warriors cannot overcome being outnumbered and unprepared. Third, logistics and endurance can be decisive. Harold's ability to move his army 300 kilometers in 6 days was extraordinary and gave him a crucial advantage. But the exhaustion this caused contributed to his defeat at Hastings, showing that there are limits to what even the best troops can endure. Fourth, defensive terrain matters, but only if you have time to use it properly. The River Derwent could have been a formidable defensive position if Harold had been prepared to defend it. Instead, it became an obstacle that divided his own forces. Fifth, leadership is crucial in crisis. When Harald Hardrada was killed, Tostig and Eystein Ore managed to keep the Vikings fighting despite their desperate situation. Lesser leaders might have seen their army collapse immediately. Beyond the immediate military and political consequences, Stamford Bridge had a significant cultural impact that lasted for centuries. In England, the battle became part of the national story, though always in the shadow of Hastings. It was proof that Englishmen could defeat Vikings in open battle. Later English writers, particularly during periods of national pride, would point to Stamford Bridge as evidence of English military prowess. In Norway and the wider Scandinavian world, Stamford Bridge became a symbol of the end of the Viking Age. The sagas that preserved and transmitted Norse culture treated the battle as a tragic but necessary conclusion to a great era. It became a story about the cost of ambition, the inevitability of change, and the importance of dying well. The battle also contributed to the development of the Norman yoke theory in English history. The idea that the Norman conquest was a catastrophe that destroyed a free Anglo-Saxon England. If only Harold had not had to fight at Stamford Bridge, the argument went, he would have defeated William and England would have remained English. This theory, though oversimplified, had real political impact in later centuries. Modern archaeology has added fascinating details to our understanding of Stamford Bridge. Though the exact site of the battle has been debated, metal detector surveys and excavations in the area have turned up artifacts consistent with the historical accounts. Arrowheads, spear points, and sword fragments have been found in fields around the traditional battle site. Some of these weapons show Scandinavian characteristics, supporting the presence of a Norwegian army. Others are consistent with Anglo-Saxon manufacture. Human remains have occasionally been discovered, though usually in fragmentary condition and difficult to date precisely. Some may be from the battle, others from other periods. Medieval battlefields were rarely the sites of mass graves. Bodies were typically buried more widely dispersed. Most intriguingly, some of the weapons found show signs of extensive combat damage. Bent swords, broken spear tips, crushed helmets. These mute artifacts speak to the ferocity of the fighting. The bridge itself has long since disappeared, replaced by later structures. The current bridge at Stamford Bridge dates from much more recent times, but the river crossing is essentially the same, and it's easy to imagine how a single determined warrior could have held such a choke point. Stamford Bridge can be usefully compared to other famous last stands and ambush battles throughout history. Like Thermopylae, it featured a small force, the berserker on the bridge, holding a crucial choke point against overwhelming numbers. Like Cannae, it demonstrated the vulnerability of a force caught unprepared and unable to use its usual tactics. Like Waterloo, it was followed shortly by another battle that overshadowed it in historical memory. But Stamford Bridge also has unique characteristics. Few battles have seen such a complete annihilation of an invading force. Few military expeditions have gone from apparent success to utter catastrophe so quickly, and few battles have so clearly marked the end of an entire historical era. The battle also illustrates the dangers of overconfidence. Harald Hardrada had won dozens of battles over his career. He had defeated larger forces, escaped from apparently hopeless situations, and survived where lesser men died. This track record made him careless. He could not imagine that an English army could arrive so quickly, so he took inadequate precautions. Harold Godwinson, having won at Stamford Bridge, may have fallen into a similar trap at Hastings. He had just won a stunning victory using aggressive tactics. Why not use the same approach against William? But what worked against surprised, unarmored Vikings did not work against prepared Norman knights. Behind the grand historical narrative are countless personal tragedies. Each of the thousands of men who died at Stamford Bridge had a story, a family, hopes, fears, dreams. Consider a young Norwegian warrior, perhaps 20 years old, who joined Harold's expedition seeking glory and wealth. He might have been a farmer's son, hoping to earn enough in England to buy his own land, marry, start a family. Instead, he died in a muddy English field, far from home, his body thrown into an unmarked mass grave. Or an English housecarl, a professional soldier who had served Harold for years. He survived Stamford Bridge, perhaps even distinguished himself in the fighting. Then 3 weeks later, exhausted and still recovering from his wounds, he fought and died at Hastings. His family received no compensation, no pension. His widow and children faced poverty. Tostig Godwinson's story is particularly tragic. He was a capable administrator who ruled Northumbria harshly, but not by the standards of the time, unusually so. The rebellion against him was as much about Northumbrian separatism as about his specific failings. His brother's betrayal, as Tostig saw it, turned him from a loyal royal official into a traitor allied with Norway. He died fighting his own brother on English soil in a war that benefited no one. Harald Hardrada himself, what must his final moments have been like? He was a man who had spent his entire adult life as a warrior, who had fought from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. He had been rich, powerful, feared across Europe, and he died from a chance arrow in a battle he had not expected to fight, brought down by an enemy he had underestimated. These personal stories, mostly lost to history, remind us that grand historical events are composed of individual human experiences, each with its own meaning and tragedy. Over the centuries, the story of Stamford Bridge has accumulated myths and legends that obscure the historical reality. Separating fact from fiction is challenging, but important. The berserker on the bridge is probably based on a real incident, but the details have been embellished. Did he really kill 40 men? Probably not. That's likely an exaggeration. But he probably did hold the bridge for some time and inflict significant casualties. The story of his death, speared from below through the bridge planks, has the ring of truth. It's specific and unusual enough that someone probably wouldn't just invent it. The story of Harald Godwinson offering Tostig a pardon and Harald Hardrada 7 feet of ground is recorded in multiple sources and is probably authentic in its essentials, though the exact words may have been polished by later chroniclers. The number 300 ships has symbolic significance in Norse culture and should probably not be taken literally. The actual number was probably smaller, though still substantial. The claim that only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back is also probably symbolic. Literally true, perhaps, but selected for retelling because of its dramatic power. What we can say with confidence is that Harald Hardrada invaded northern England with a large army, won a victory at Fulford, was preparing to receive York's submission when Harald Godwinson arrived unexpectedly, and was decisively defeated at Stamford Bridge with enormous casualties. The Battle of Stamford Bridge cast a long shadow over subsequent history in ways both obvious and subtle. Most obviously, it weakened Harald Godwinson's army at the critical moment, contributing to his defeat at Hastings and thus to the Norman conquest. This changed the course of English history fundamentally. The language, culture, laws, and institutions of England all bear the mark of Norman influence. Would these changes have happened without the Norman conquest? Some probably would have, but others certainly would not. Less obviously, Stamford Bridge marked a shift in the balance of power around the North Sea. Before 1066, Scandinavian kingdoms were major players in English politics. After 1066, that influence diminished sharply. England looked more to France and less to Scandinavia. This reorientation had long-term consequences for trade, diplomacy, and culture. The battle also marked a transition in military technology and tactics. The era of the Viking raid was ending. The era of the armored knight was beginning. Within a century, castles would dominate European warfare, and cavalry would be supreme on the battlefield. The Vikings' favored tactics, mobility, surprise, amphibious operations, were becoming less effective. Finally, Stamford Bridge demonstrated the importance of state capacity. Harald Godwinson could mobilize an army and march it hundreds of kilometers in days because England, despite its political divisions, had developed administrative structures that made such mobilization possible. This pointed toward the future, towards stronger, more centralized kingdoms that could project power more effectively. Today, nearly 1,000 years later, Stamford Bridge is a quiet village in Yorkshire. Tourists occasionally visit, drawn by the battle's fame. A memorial commemorates the event, but mostly life goes on as it has for generations. It's easy to forget that this peaceful place was once the site of one of history's great slaughters. The meadows where children now play were once soaked with blood. The river where people fish once ran red. The fields where farmers plow were once carpeted with the dead. We should remember, not because war is glorious, it isn't. Not because the Vikings or the English were heroes or villains. They were simply men of their time, acting according to their values and interests. But because their stories are part of the human story, the young Norwegian warrior who died far from home, the English soldier who defended his homeland, the berserker who held the bridge, King Harald who gambled everything and lost, King Harald who won the battle but lost the war, all of them were human beings who lived, fought, and died. Their experiences, their choices, their fates are worth remembering. In remembering them, we remember something important about human nature. Our capacity for courage, for loyalty, for sacrifice, but also our capacity for violence, for cruelty, for the terrible wastes of war. Stamford Bridge shows us both the nobility and the horror of medieval warfare. The Vikings who sailed from Norway in 1066 were part of a long tradition. For nearly 3 centuries, Scandinavian raiders and settlers had shaped European history. They had discovered Iceland and Greenland, reached America, founded kingdoms in Russia and France, served as elite warriors from Byzantium to England. Stamford Bridge ended all that. In the span of a few terrible hours, an entire age came to an end. The Vikings would raid no more, conquer no more, terrorize Europe no more. They would become instead settled Christian kingdoms, trading partners, participants in the European mainstream rather than threats from outside it. This transformation was probably inevitable. Societies change. Nothing lasts forever. But the suddenness and violence of the change at Stamford Bridge made it particularly dramatic. 10,000 warriors vanished in an hour, and with them vanished a way of life that had endured for centuries. As we conclude this long journey through the events of September 25th, 1066, certain questions remain. They are questions without definitive answers, but they are worth contemplating. Was Harald Hardrada's invasion doomed from the start, or did he come close to success? If York had not delayed in fully submitting, if Harold Godwinson had been slower to respond, if the weather had stayed favorable for the Norwegians, might Harold have established himself as King of England? Could Harold Godwinson have won at both Stamford Bridge and Hastings? Was it the exhaustion from fighting 2 campaigns in 3 weeks that doomed him at Hastings? Or would William of Normandy have defeated him regardless? What would England have been like under Norwegian rule? Would Harold have been a good king, or would his harsh methods have provoked rebellion? Would England have been drawn into Scandinavian affairs, becoming part of a North Sea empire rather than turning toward France? These questions have no answers. History happened as it did, and we cannot know how alternative paths might have played out. But in contemplating these possibilities, we understand better the contingency of historical events. Small decisions, chance occurrences, the fortunes of weather and disease and individual choices, all shape the course of history in ways we can only partially understand. What we can say with certainty is that Stamford Bridge mattered. It was not just another medieval battle, forgotten except by specialists. It was a turning point, a moment when the old world of the Vikings gave way to the new world of the medieval kingdoms. The 10,000 Vikings who vanished in an hour were the last great Viking army. After them, there would be no more. The dragon ships would rot on beaches, the war axes would rust, the sagas would be written down and preserved as cultural artifacts rather than living traditions. An age had ended, and as the September sun set on that blood-soaked field in Yorkshire, a new age was beginning, one that the dead Vikings would not see, but that their defeat had helped to create. So we remember them, not as heroes or villains, but as men who lived in their time, who fought for what they believed in, who died as warriors of their era died. Their story is over, but it echoes still through the centuries, reminding us of the terrible cost of ambition, the tragedy of war, and the inexorable march of historical change. The meadows around Stamford Bridge are quiet now, peaceful under English skies. But if you listen carefully on certain September evenings when the mist rises from the River Derwent, you might almost hear the echoes of that distant day. The clash of shields, the cries of warriors, the thunder of battle. And then, as the mist clears and the modern world reasserts itself, only silence remains. The silence of 1,000 years, and the memory of the day when 10,000 Vikings vanished from the earth, taking an entire age with them into history's night. The end total runtime, approximately 180 minutes.